الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له هو يتولى الصالحين وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فبعد انقطاع طويل نحو 3 أسابيع نعود إلى ما كنا فيه من كتاب زاد المعاد في هدي خير العباد للإمام الحافظ الفقيه شيخ الإسلام شمس الدين ابن قيم الجوزية رحمه الله تعالى. وهذا الكتاب من أعظم ما ألف في هذا الباب، وبابه واسع في الحقيقة، فهو كتاب سيرة وكتاب أحكام وكتاب شرح السنة وكتاب في تاريخ رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأصحابه، وكتاب شمائل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم مما يختص به، وكتاب في دلائل النبوة. فهو كتاب واسع وفيه من الحكم وفيه من الآثار وفيه من العلم الجم ما يجعله من خزائن العلم المعروفة في المكتبة الشرعية الإسلامية في تاريخ الإسلام. وقد كنا في باب الصيام وهدي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في الصيام، فلنبتدئ بذكر أهمية الصيام، ثم لننتقل بعد ذلك إلى تاريخ تشريع الصيام، ثم بعد ذلك إلى بعض أحكام الصيام من أركانه ومفسدات الصيام كذلك إن شاء الله. We now are continuing after quite a break that was out of our control with regards to Zadul-Ma'ad fi hadi khayr al-ibad. We've now resumed our class after a very long 3 weeks. And this book, Zadul-Ma'ad, obviously, as we mention often, and the reason why I mention it so often is because I want these names to ingrain themselves into people's minds. The names of our scholars, the names of the companions, radiyallahu anhum, the names of the various authors, the names of the different scholars and their specialties. I am constantly repeating these names in hopes that these names would become commonplace to the listener. Just as, unfortunately, we have been bombarded by popular society with the various names of celebrities and non-mentionables, it is important that we strive and go out of our way, actually, to learn who our forefathers are. Because a person who has no history has no identity. And so, this book, again, I reiterate, is authored by Al-Imam, the great Mufassir, the great Faqih of Islam, Shamsuddin ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, rahimahullah ta'ala. And Ibn al-Qayyim wrote this book, Zad al-Ma'ad, and it is one of the most groundbreaking and influential books in this particular genre, or in this particular vein of subject. Now, when I say subject, you know, Zad al-Ma'ad kind of broke the mold. It's not a book that has a particular subject per se. It's a book that is jami'. It has many, many subjects. But all of these subjects revolve around a common point, and that is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it is a book of fiqh. It's a book of explaining the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's a book of hadith. It's a book of medicine. He has an entire volume, which is the medicine of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he alphabetized that, that volume. So any illness or any issue, you look under the letter regarding that particular, just like a dictionary, and you find Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah mentions whatever was narrated from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with regards to that particular issue. Likewise, it's a book of the biography of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's a book of history, the history of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions. It's a book regarding the things that are particular to him sallallahu alaihi wasallam that really get us to know who he was and give us details about his actual physical attributes and so forth. These are called shama'il, things that he would do, things that he would constantly do, things that are particular to him, the names of his wives, the names of his mu'adhineen, the names of his guards, the names of his ambassadors, the names of his disciples in memorizing and reciting and transmitting the Quran, etc. So it's a very, very broad book. It's a very expansive book. But since its writing, this book has been a reference for everyone who writes in this topic and on this subject after Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah. Even Ibn Hajar rahimahullah in his astounding work Fath al-Bari fi Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari, he mentions Ibn Al-Qayyim a lot and he references this book a lot because his book Fath al-Bari is an explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari, and it's almost like you can't do that without Ibn Al-Qayyim and his book Zadul-Ma'ad coming into play at some point there. We had stopped, or we had taken our break at the point where we reached the chapter in the book of fasting, how the Prophet ﷺ would fast and so on and so forth. We will get into those details and we will discuss, inshallah ta'ala, tonight. We will begin with the virtue of fasting, and second of all, we will get into the history of fasting, and then after that we will get into the rulings of fasting. What is fasting and its pillars, along with that which invalidates a person's fast or which nullifies a person's fast, which you may be surprised is actually very simple, a lot more simpler than you may have previously thought. The Prophet ﷺ commanded fasting, and he encouraged fasting at any time. A person can fast any time of the month, any time of the week, any time of the year, but there are certain times when a person should fast along with another day, meaning that you should not specifically choose this particular day to fast only in. And what we're speaking about is fasting Friday alone or fasting Saturday alone. Now, if a person has an obligatory fast, or if they fast the fasting of Dawood alayhi salam, which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam allowed and encouraged, he was asked about the best of fasting. He said, خير الصيام صيام داود عليه السلام كان يصوم يوما ويفطر يوما. That Dawood alayhi salam, the best of fasting is the fasting of Dawood, the Prophet Dawood alayhi salam. He would fast one day and he would break his fast the next. So every other day he would fast. Now, if a person fasts in this way, one week their fast is going to land on a Friday alone, right? And the next week it's going to land on a Saturday alone. That's how it's going to work. If a person is fasting in this way, that's fine. Or if a person has some day that, let's say you're working all week, and you have one day off, let's say it's a Saturday or a Friday, and you have some fast that you need to do, and you fast that day in order to, because it's your day off and it's easier for you to fast or what have you, and it's fine to fast on that day alone. However, it is not permissible to choose Friday to fast or to choose Saturday to fast out of reverence for these days specifically, right? So Friday is a revered day with the Muslims, but we do not choose it to fast alone on that day. So the Prophet ﷺ specifically said in a narration, these narrations on the authority of Ibn Umar and Abi Hurairah and others in a Sunnah, that do not fast Friday alone without fasting a day before it or a day after it. Likewise, fasting Saturday. Do not fast Saturday alone without fasting a day before it or a day after it. And that is to separate ourselves from other religions that honor these particular days of the week with fasting. Now, otherwise, a person is encouraged to fast any time of the week or the month, and there is a time when fasting is obligatory, obviously, with conditions. And that is the month of Ramadan. Month of Ramadan is the 9th month in the Islamic lunar calendar. It is either 29 or 30 days. And it is a time when a person is to fast based on the actions of the general mass of their community, which is another topic that we will touch on that is very important, inshallah, with regards to fasting. Fasting the month of Ramadan, that is. But before we get into that, we'll speak about fasting in general. Fasting in general is not only, it has many virtues. A very good book to read on this would be the book of the virtues of fasting from Riyadh al-Salihin, the book of fasting in Sahih al-Bukhari, book of fasting in Sahih Muslim. These are very prominent books, very good books to read with regards to the virtues of fasting. But one of the most important things that fasting does for the person is that it aids a person in controlling his or her sexual drive. This is very important because the Prophet ﷺ was asked, as is in a Sunnah, about the thing that lands most people in the hellfire. And he said, Al-famu wal-farju. He said, the mouth and the private parts. These two organs and what a person does with them, they are the tongue and the private parts. They are the two things that most lead people into the hellfire. So one of the things that fasting does is it helps you to control your sexual desire. There is a narration in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man istata'a minkum al-ba'ata falyatazawwaj, wa man lam yastati' fa'alayhi bis-sawm." He said, whoever of you has the ability to marry, then he should do so. And if you are unable, especially he said from the youth, Ya Shabab al-Muslimin, he directed this to the youth, but it's to anybody, but especially those who are young have a much stronger sexual drive, obviously, than those who are older. For the most part, again, society and the environment will play a huge part in that. What do I mean by that? Well, if we live in a hyper-sexualized society, like we do now, and it's not just here in America, it's all over the world, because of the internet and because of the exportation of ideas and godlessness, we see that we live in a very hypersexualized time. Everywhere you look, everything, the way people dress, the way people speak, their jokes, the videos, innocent things, even things like children's TV shows, even cartoon characters are drawn in a way that articulates sexuality. And this is something that's extremely dangerous and deadly in our time, and it's one of the greatest traps of a shaitan, because a shaitan uses two main things to envelop society in, to destroy religion in society. Two main things. He uses oppression from tyrants and those in charge of people, and he uses as well people's desires, chiefly sexual drive, because it drives to the heart of human nature. These two things are two of the chief ways that a shaitan destroys societies, with oppression and desire. And so, if a person lives in such a society or such a time, you may find a person who's 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, and they are sexually deviant, right? Sexually deviant with sexual orientations that are outrageous, not just heterosexual tendencies. And why is that? That's because of the environment. The environment makes this 60, 70, 50, 80-year-old man or woman constantly think about this thing as if they are teenagers or as if they are in their 20s. They take pride in it, and it's, chip on their shoulder with regards to this, and this is very troubling, very worrisome. Usually a person's sexual drive is to deplete after they reach a certain age and they reach a certain level of wisdom and they calm down, right? And the enthusiasm of youth leaves their body. These things become a marginal part of their life. It doesn't become a chief part of their life. However, when society is hyper-sexualized, as we see it is around us, a person may become very old and still be involved in these kinds of things. So the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever has the ability to marry, then he should. And if a person is unable to marry, then he is to fast. Because fasting is a type of armor, and it helps a person to get hold and control better his or her sexual drive. Now, fasting here in this narration has been explained by the scholars in two ways. Number one, fasting, obviously legislative fasting. Fasting, not eating or drinking anything from the break of dawn until sunset. But also, fasting can be used in a linguistic sense, which means that a person not only fasts in the legislative sense, but they also fast in the linguistic sense, which means that they lessen the amount of food that they take. They don't eat till they're full all of the time. Because when a person is hungry, they are less prone and their sex drive is weakened. When a person is completely satisfied and they are full, right, from eating and drinking, they're not hungry, they're not thirsty, the sex drive starts to climb. And sometimes with certain people, it can get, grossly out of control. And so it's not just that a person fasts, Monday and Thursday or fast, but it also means that if you have an inability to redirect your sex drive to the point that it is out of control, then a person is to lessen their food intake. They're not to eat a full meal make themselves completely full. They should eat moderately. This is also a type of fasting and also one of the implications of the narration. Because if I eat a huge meal before I start fasting, and then I fast for 10 hours, and then I eat a huge meal after, I'm kind of shooting myself in the toe. But if a person, whether they're fasting or not, they are always eating moderately, this will help a person to get these impulses under control. Now about the history of the legislation of fasting. It's important for us to know the history of the legislation of fasting. ابن القيم رحمه الله تعالى يقول: وكان للصوم رتب ثلاث إحداهما إيجابه بوصف التخيير بينه وبين أن يطعم عن كل يوم مسكينا، والثانية تحتيمه، لكن كان الصائم تحتيمه الحتم هو الواجب، تحتيمه يعني إيجابه، لكن كان الصائم إذا نام قبل أن يطعم حرم عليه الطعام والشراب إلى الليلة القابلة، فنسخ ذلك بالرتبة الثالثة وهي التي استقر عليها الشرع إلى يوم القيامة. He mentions that fasting in the way that we have it, fasting the month of Ramadan, okay, it had three stages in its legislation. The first stage was when Ramadan was first made obligatory to fast. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ. This was in the second year after Hijrah. And he said, شَهْرُ رَمَضَانَ الَّذِي أُنزِلَ فِيهِ الْقُرْآنِ. So these verses here, these two verses in Surah Al-Baqarah, they articulate the obligation of fasting, and they specify the month of Ramadan specifically, that is the month that we are to fast. Now, this fasting of the month of Ramadan had three stages to it. The first stage is that a person was commanded to fast, but they had the choice to either fast or feed a poor person for every day that they miss. So just like a person who's terminally ill, or a person who is, they have a kafara for fasting, so they cannot fast because of old age or because of long-term sickness or illness or whatever it is. So they give the kafara, right? They give the expiation, which is to feed a poor person for every day of the month of Ramadan that they miss. This was something that anyone could do at the very beginning. So when fasting was first obligated, a person could do either or. They could either choose to fast, or they could choose to feed a poor person on behalf of that day, whether they were young or old, sick or healthy. This was the first stage. The second stage was that fasting became obligatory upon everybody who was able-bodied to do so and was not traveling or ill. And this stage had a very specific condition to it, and that is, if a person, let's say a person fasted all day, and Maghrib came in, and they fell asleep before eating, they were not able to eat again until the next day. So, if a person is fasting, Maghrib comes in, they go home, and they were sitting, waiting for the food to be made or something like that, and they fell asleep without eating anything, and they woke up, khalas, they can't eat until the next day at Maghrib. That was the second stage. The third stage was fasting as we know it today. It doesn't have that condition on it anymore. Now, a person may say, well, why these stages, right? First of all, when people were first obligated to fast the entirety of the month of Ramadan, it took an entire society to adjust to this. It wasn't just one person. So when we look at it from this aspect, we see why a person would not implement these stages now. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that, let's say a person comes into Islam new, right? Or just starts to fast. Well, then why wouldn't they start with having the choice of either fasting or feeding a poor person, right? Because that's how fasting was first obligated, correct? Yes, but that was for a society as a whole. That was not for individuals, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was obligating something upon an entire society. And so, this stage of intensifying fasting until it is the way that we have it today, these stages were critical in order for the entirety of society to be able to transition smoothly. However, when we have one singular person who enters into Islam or one person who begins to fast, we don't have that issue. This one person can just start fasting, right? So this is why a nasikh took place, which is that a ruling would be sent down and then added to or taken from this ruling to adjust for the time and place in order to make legislation easier, or in order to make legislation at first very difficult and then go to something which is easier so that it can train and build discipline in the people. It goes both ways. It can start out very hard and then become easier, or it can start out very easy and become gradually more difficult. So we have the first is that as a society, they were first commanded to fast the month of Ramadan, but they could choose between giving the kafara or fasting. But fasting was always considered to be superior. وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. He said, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if you are to fast, that is better. So, you had the choice, but fasting was encouraged and was better than giving the kafara. Second of all, we had an intensification, right? So first we had it was very easy. Then it became actually more difficult because if you fell asleep before eating, you had to fast the next day as well without eating anything. You couldn't have suhoor or anything. So that made it very difficult, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transitioned from easy to extreme or difficult, and then brought it back to a middle place, which was it's obligated, but as long as the sun is down, you can eat or drink anything that you like. And this was to adjust the society to be able to follow this legislation. Again, we're speaking about the first society of Islam. When the children of the companions were born into this, they were born into a world where the month of Ramadan was fasted, right? So we didn't need this kind of legislation. When people entered into Islam, they entered into a community of people that were all fasting and had this discipline. And so they taught this discipline to others. But when the first people were commanded to fast, the month of Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, they had to build up this discipline. They had to build up this momentum. And this is why these stages were the way they are. So these are the three stages in the legislation of fasting the month of Ramadan, after which the third stage was to fast from the break of dawn until the sun set, no matter how long or short the day is, for those who are able-bodied, right? And those who are not traveling. So there are three instances when a person breaks his fast, when a person doesn't fast the month of Ramadan. Three chief instances. Number one is that a person is traveling. Number two is that a person is ill. Number three, that a person is in battle. If a person is in battle, they don't fast. okay, even if it's Ramadan. We have in the conquest of Mecca, which was in the 7th or 8th year, difference of opinion amongst the historians, after Hijrah, we see that the Prophet ﷺ commanded the companions as they were at the gates of Mecca, and this was in Ramadan, to break their fast. So they were commanded to break their fast. Why were they commanded to break their fast? They were commanded to break their fast because they were entering into a situation where battle was expected, where fighting was expected. Now, we said three main things, three chief things. Number one was traveling. Number two was illness. Number three was battle. Now, there are other exceptions, but they fall under the generalities of these three. Okay? What do I mean by that? A woman who is breastfeeding, or a woman who is pregnant, or a very old man or very old woman. These people, they fall under the generality of those who have the ruling of being ill, whether it's short-term or long-term, right? So, a person who's very old, for instance, this person is able to fast, but fasting is very difficult for this person. Or it may be impossible for this person to fast. But even if they can fast, but with great difficulty, they fall under the generality of the ruling of one who is either ill, short-time illness, or long-term illness. Being that it's for the sake of old age, it's usually going to be that of long-term illness, which means that they will pay the expiation by feeding a poor person for every day that they miss of Ramadan. Likewise, a woman who is breastfeeding or a woman who is pregnant. A woman who is pregnant for 9 months, they have time to make up their fast, correct? They have time to make up their fast. If she is only going to, and this is a question that is often asked, if she is going to be able to make up her fast before the next year of Ramadan comes around, then she just makes up her fast. That's it. But if she is breastfeeding, then in that case she will pay the kafara, right? So this question comes up a lot, and that is, a woman may be pregnant, and then when she has her baby, she's going to breastfeed her baby, so now she doesn't have to fast because she's breastfeeding, and then after that she gets pregnant again, and then after that she's breastfeeding again, and then after that, so she might have 6, 7, 8 years. I had a woman actually ask me one time, she had 8 years of Ramadan worth of fasting, 8 months of fasting to make up, to make it up. Of course not. You're going to be fasting the entire year. And the most strenuous expiation or punishment in the Quran with regards to fasting is how many months? How many months is it? 2 months, right? That's for accidentally killing somebody, right? Or that's for kafaratul al-dhihar, right? It's 2 months fasting. So we see that the greatest amount that has ever been placed on a person with regards to fasting is how many months? 2 months. So if a woman misses 2 Ramadan, she has 2 months worth of fasting. This is now transitioned from being fasting the month of Ramadan to incur the favor of Allah into a kind of stressful punishment, right? Likewise, the punishment for intercourse during Ramadan is what? 2 months fasting, right? So this question comes up a lot, and that is that should the woman make up her fast? The answer is no. If she misses more than one Ramadan because of the type of issue that we just mentioned, then she merely pays the kafara, the expiation, feeding a single poor person, for every day that she misses of Ramadan, right? For every day that she misses of Ramadan. That's it. She doesn't have to make up 2 and 3 and 4 years worth of fasting. This is excessive. And this is the fatwa of Jabir ibn Abdullah and Abu Hurairah and others, as Al-Tabari rahimahullah ta'ala mentions in his tafsir. Now, this is because she falls under the generality of somebody who is, she has the same ruling as someone who is ill with a long-term illness, right? Because if a person has a long-term illness that prevents them from fasting for 2 years, 3 years, doesn't think that they're going to ever be better, or the projection of their healing process is going to be far into the future, then this person doesn't fast. This person pays the expiation. Likewise is the issue of a person who has become very old, or a person who is unable to fast because she is either breastfeeding or she is pregnant. So this is a question that a lot of people ask, and that is the answer to that question. It comes up every year. I'm sure it'll come up this year anyways, but it's good to know for those of us who are married, those of us who have, that the question comes up that a woman misses Ramadan or misses days of Ramadan due to pregnancy or breastfeeding. What should she do? The answer is she should make up these days unless another Ramadan comes around. Then she will only pay the expiation for those days, right? Now, what are the, upon whom is fasting obligatory? Upon whom is fasting obligatory? This is a question that's very important for us to know who are the people who are obligated to fast. So the scholars tell us from collecting the verses and the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ and the patterns of Islam and Islamic law and jurisprudence, we see that we have conditions for a person to meet, criteria in order for fasting to be considered obligatory upon this person. The first is that a person is baligh, that a person is of age, of pubescent age. We're speaking about obligatory, okay, binding, wajib. When we speak about it is wajib, it is obligatory, nothing is obligatory upon a person until they are of pubescent age, correct? They have to reach the age of puberty before anything is obligatory upon them. But does this mean that we don't have our children fast before they reach the age of puberty? What is the age of puberty? Let's speak about this first. The absolute latest, في مذهب الإمام الشافعي وغيره, the absolute latest for a person who is a late bloomer, as they would, to reach the age of puberty is 15 years old. Anyone above the age of 15 years old has reached the age of puberty. All of the legislations of Islam are binding upon this person. Notice how I said 15 and not what comes to mind usually when we think of adulthood? 18, right? Why does 18 come to mind? Huh? Tell me. I can't hear you, man. 18 comes to mind because that's the society we grew up in, right? Legal age of adulthood is 18, right? But when we look at the legislation of Islam, and that is the madhab of Abi Hanifa rahimahullah, but it's not really based on anything substantial. The correct opinion is 15. And the reason for that is that we see Ibn Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, the youth would come and stand whenever companions would go out for battle. And they would come and ask to go to battle. But the Prophet ﷺ would walk and choose who was allowed and who was too young from the youth of the companions radiallahu anhum. So Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu stood in this line, and he was 14, as he said, and the Prophet ﷺ sent him back. But the next year, he stood in the same line, and he was 15, and the Prophet ﷺ took him with him to battle. So what does this mean? This means that at the age of 15, this kind of battle becomes obligatory upon a person, or a person becomes eligible for battle at this age. From this narration, the scholars have taken, the fuqaha have taken that the latest age of puberty is 15 years old as the latest age. The earliest age could be 9 years old, 10 years old, based on what the body does. Puberty is when the mind reaches a certain level of understanding in which it becomes able to comprehend right and wrong and the consequences of right and wrong. This is the essence of puberty. Okay? Now, when the mind, the brain, reaches that level, it starts to secrete certain chemicals into the body, and the body starts to show signs of that maturity. Okay? And the signs of that maturity come in the form of a girl having her monthly cycle, a boy reaching the age of ihtilam, which means that they would have a wet dream, an experience in their sleep, or that a person starts to get armpit hair and have pubic hair. That's why it's called pubic hair, because it is part of puberty. And so these are indicators that the brain and the mind has reached a level of maturity in which this person can now be held accountable for right and wrong, and that they understand not just that this is right and wrong, but they understand the consequences of right and wrong. So puberty is an indicator of that. We will continue with this topic next week, inshaAllah. Allahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Thank you very much for your presence, your attendance.